Okay, so let's start by getting the basics of Loopy Pro set up. When you open a new Loopy Pro template, so you go up to the little folder icon and then go to New Project, it will, I'll just load a new one. It'll look exactly like this. And switch it to 2. Oh my god, that's so much fucking better. So, we have our hardware input set up for my mic. Now, I'm just going to be starting from a blank template here and kind of programming everything live. I know kind of my constraints here are how do we build a Loopy Pro setup that is well suited for a mic input and some other kind of input. So I'm just dealing with 2 inputs. This can expand to a lot of other things, but I think it is different from just a single input looper because you have to kind of deal with different ways of ingesting these 2 inputs. So first things first, before we get anywhere else, let's just get a second input set up. So if you see this plus icon when you're in the mixer interface down in the bottom right, hit the plus icon, go to add a hardware input. By default, it detects that I have the Scarlett hooked up, and so I'm going to switch it to 1. Hit the 1 button there. It showed me that I had 2 already connected, so we now have an input for 1. And that's hooked up to the OP1. Let me switch to a different sound on here. I was going to mix the OP1 down a little bit. A little loud. Okay. One thing that is just a conceptual thing that I tend to do is have in-interface means of mixing. This is no slight to the Loopy interface for the mixer. I find that it's a little difficult for me if I'm trying to be performative and quick live, especially because they have extra headroom at the top. That's something to just know. So my mic here is hitting, this is 0 dB where all of these little mixer heads are set. I find that the danger of these mixers is that you don't drop it right back to 0 dB when you try to mix live. So getting input mixing is actually a really good first step for these 2 inputs so that I can adjust live. It's a good little first example of programming. So I'm going to close the mixer interface, and I am going to go down to the little pencil icon. I actually want these to be above here. So I'm just going to grab one of these just so it appears above rather than below, and I don't have to rearrange everything. If I wanted to rearrange stuff, I can just grab stuff, drag it around, or I can do a selection if I'm not touching anything and I can move it around just for rearranging purposes. Okay, this slider, when I tap the little pencil icon, I get this menu here. It says slider 1. I'm going to rename this just so I know. So I'm going to call this mic in. So with this slider, you have when value change is when the slider moves, press is when you actually touch the slider, release is when your finger comes off the slider, double tap is when you double tap the slider, 2-finger tap is when you tap the slider with 2 fingers. That gives you a lot of options for behaviors for this slider. So we go here, value change, and I want to adjust. These are all the things you can adjust with this. So you've got clip actions, which will adjust specific clips or types of clips, color groups, effects, widgets, session, MIDI, and then what we need is the bottom one here, audio source actions. So I'm going to adjust parameter. I'm going to do the hardware input. And now this is a little annoying. I think you might be able to rename these hardware inputs. Put it hardware input 1. Let's give it a try. So there we go. Nailed it in 1. So we have our mic in slider that allows us to adjust the volume of the mic. Now, I'm going to add a quick behavior that just is an easy reset button. I've been doing this with a lot of my sliders. There's a couple of ways to do this, and I want to show you kind of maybe what people might assume is the default way to do it, and then I'll show you a way that I found is actually a much cleaner way to do this, especially when you're managing a lot of inputs and controls. So if I go to double tap, I want to double tap to be able to reset this fader or this slider to 0. The default thing you could do, and this actually will totally work, is you go to audio source actions, adjust parameter. And now I can do the same thing I did for adjusting the slider. I say hardware input, set the value to 0 dB. When I double tap, it'll set the value to 0 dB. That's great, except if I want to change the behavior of that slider, or I have like 20 different sliders that I all have to manage, or I want to adjust the gain of this input in a bunch of different ways. Like I want to be able to nudge it up and down based on different behaviors. If I have to assign the gain directly of that input every single time, and then I want to change any of it, I have to go back and change every one of those behaviors that adjusts the gain to whatever new thing that I'm doing. So a much easier way, and gives you actually a lot of control, is to go in here and instead say, on double tap, trigger widget. And trigger widget, if this gets expanded on in Loopy Pro, I think is going to be one of the most powerful tools for editing and creating interfaces. But I say the target is the mic in, and then we just say the value is 1, which is 0 dB in this case. Give it a little bit of a ramp so that it doesn't just jump up to that value. It actually moves to that value. And now, control the input. And if I bring it down and I'm really quiet, double tap will jump me right back up, so the volume's all the way up. So that's a really nice way of managing your inputs. Now, what's great about this is, if I want to now manage the input volume of the OP1, I can just copy the mic in, I can paste it, call this OP1 in, and then I can go in here, and I don't actually have to change this mic in value change. I just go here, adjust parameter, and select the other hardware input, and this automatically is just remapped to changing itself. It already knows. So now I don't have to do anything else. This is already controlling the input. I have to hold the mic between my knees to do this. But there you go. Now we have inputs, and we can manage our behaviors there. All right, now let's get to some of the fun stuff. We've got things set up. We can now record loops. So we've got... So that's great. I love that. Let's start getting into some of the setup stuff and how we want to record loops. One thing that I've been setting up for every single one of my Loopy Pro setups, I find it super useful. It's one way of managing multiple inputs. I think there's plenty of other ways, but this is the way I like, is to have basically what I'm calling a record buffer or a record bus that I send things to, and then anything can record from them. So I'm going to set both the OP1 and my mic to only go to the output. So these are not going to go to any of these loopers. So if I start recording, there's no input. There's nothing being sent to them. Now, what I will do is add a bus. Now, bus A, you can see right now if I add this, let me add bus A to my mic. If I turn up bus A, I'm going to be really loud. It's because bus A is going to the output. Now, bus A doesn't actually need to go to the output at all. Bus A goes to all of the color destinations. So now we have control over what can record. So you can see right now my mic is going, but there's nothing going into bus A. So I can record with any of these loopers. Nothing gets recorded because there's nothing going through bus A. But if I turn up my mic in bus A, and now I start recording, now I start recording, and now I start recording, and now I start recording. Now I can loop stuff coming from my mic. I can choose what goes in, and I can kind of mix what goes into bus A, and then I can record from it. Now, another cool thing about that is I can add that same bus to all of my loopers. So now, where I have my mic going into bus A, we have this terrible loop that I will turn down a little bit. By the way, if you do a little spiral motion on a loop, you can adjust the volume of that loop individually. Now, what I can do is I'm being sent into bus A. I'm going to now send orange into bus A. And I'm going to actually take myself out. Now you can see orange is going through bus A. And now I just recorded this output of orange into green. So this gives a lot of flexibility for example, applying effects on top of one of my looping buses, and then re-recording those effects into another looper or into itself. You can get some really interesting recording patterns that way. Now let's set up some controls for that, because doing it like this it works, but it's a little manual. So I will set up here a button. This button is going to correspond to my mic, so I'm going to put it next to my mic. And I'm going to use some swipe behaviors. Now, this is a thing that's unique to buttons. I believe this actually came from Beardy Man. He mentioned to me that he had given that idea to Michael, and I think that's very cool because it's a very useful behavior. So you have all these swipe behaviors of things you can do. I really like using the swipe behaviors rather than the press and release behaviors for functions that are important. Reason being, it's just a little more precise. You know if you've done it versus it's easy to accidentally touch the screen and press the button without knowing. So I generally use swipe up and swipe down. So let's go swipe up. And I'm going to go here to audio source actions, adjust parameter, and I'm going to tap to select. One thing to note here, if I go here, you're not going to see the ability to adjust send A. It's only going to show up once I select a channel that has send A present. So I'm going to say hardware input, make sure I got the right one. Yep, I did. And now I can select send A. And I'm going to assign the value to be 100%. If I can touch that slider. I'm going to assign it to be 100% when I swipe up. And now, I'm going to go swipe down. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go adjust parameter, source, A, hardware input, send A. And I'm going to set that value to 0. So now what we have is a control that if I swipe up, and the nice part is it gets highlighted, I'm now being sent. Let me open up the mixer. You can see send A is active, swipe down, and send A is inactive. So I can now start recording. Threshold recording is on, so nothing gets recorded until it goes in. So let's say I want to record now the OP1 in. Let me just duplicate that button over, and then we will have control for both the mic in and the OP1 to be able to send to the record buffer. There you go. So now we have all of that working pretty good, we can now start messing around with our loop setups. So we've got the basic looper set up with some behaviors. I personally don't end up using this many color channels for everything. It's a lot, and realistically, I use like 2 to 3 in most setups. So what I'm going to do is clear away some of these loops, or actually what I'll do is I'm just going to break these into color groups, and I'm only going to use 2 to start. So let's make the top row green. So just for editing purposes, I went into the pencil tool. That lets you edit your layout. There's a little paint bucket tool next to it. The paint bucket tool will let me edit the colors. So I'm going to select green, and I'm just going to touch all of the loopers in the top row. That makes them all part of the green color group. And then I'm going to go, let's say, purple for the bottom row. So now we have these 2 distinct color groups, and that also just makes it easier for the purposes of demonstration and setting up everything. You could easily add more of these, as many as you want, forever. But I find you really don't need as many as you think, or at least I don't. So let's get a basic setup where we can record into a looper and then have some effects on the looper, and then we can re-record those effects back into a looper. And I feel like that's a good kind of like full setup that you could use for performance. All right, I've gone ahead and rearranged the loopers a little bit, and I've added a button here that I'm going to make green. And this is going to be the send set up exactly the same as these other sends to the record buffer. The difference here is that instead of using this hardware source or audio source actions, we're going to use color source or color group, and we're going to do adjust parameter. Otherwise, set up exactly the same. Go to specific color. We're going to use lime, and we're going to use the setting to be send A, assign value 100%, swipe down, same deal. All right, so now we have that set up for both. Swiping up, we'll set those to active. So now we have individual buttons for setting things to different record buffers. Let's get some effects, and then we can start performing with this effectively. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use Tornado. That is something you can buy on iPad. I have it on desktop as well. It's something I use a lot in various setups. So let's just go here and add an effect pre-fader. Let's add Tornado. And if I now open it up, let's get a loop in, and then we can start messing with that loop and see what it does. Good enough. So now, if I close the mixer here and just tap on Tornado, it'll open it up. I think actually by default that turns it on and off, but you can press and hold here to change the behavior. Tap to toggle or tap to show interface. So we just have the default setup in Tornado. I mean, you can already see it's very cool. And I'm just going to use my default, my setup, just the one I use a lot. So this is a setup I built in Tornado. Let's add a duplicate of that to the purple channel. Now note here, when I go to add effect, now I have an instance of Tornado loaded, which it lists here as a effect A, or Tornado with the A in the corner. If I do that, it'll be the exact same instance, which means if I add any controls to control how Tornado works, then it'll just, if I change a knob to control effect A, it'll do it on both channels. I want a new instance of Tornado on the purple channel, which I'm going to again set to my same profile, so I have the same effects loaded. And I'm going to turn those off. Now, I'm going to set up a very basic example of this with some controls over the tornado effects. You can go very deep, but it's going to take me a while if I want to build out like a whole setup for it. So let's just start real simple and just get some XY pads in there. Now, this is something I have had some issues with, so I'm just going to show it as an example because I think it's a cool way to do this if it works correctly. We'll see if it works correctly for me this time. I'm going to control tornado, and the XY is going to control controls 1 and 2. Now, I'm going to set that to, let's do 7 and 8, so I get the beat slicer stuff. Get this effect. Some nice beat repeating. So if I have this set up in the default way, where it says hold, that's nice because I can just tap anywhere and it does the effect. It's great. If I let go, it turns off tornado. Now, for a lot of effects, that's great. But in the case of tornado, tornado is actually storing the settings of these slice arrangers while they're on, which you would think is good, except that slice arrangers actually store audio and don't let audio through, which means that I'm never going to get new audio through unless I forcibly set this XY pad all the way down to 0 to turn off these. So a workaround for the time being for this is to go in here and set it to always on, and then we'll just have to deal and have to slide it to the corner, and that's what it is. But at least then you won't get stuck in weird situations, so you can have these going. Oh, gotta turn tornado on. And now, swipe up on this, and we can record into our purple channel. Now we have that recorded. And if we want to keep recycling it through effects, we can actually move that back over here. We get some cool glitchy beats. Now, okay, so here's a bug I have found, video bug reporting. If I go in here and I have this controlling this XY pad, whether I add a new one or whether I just duplicate one over, if I have it controlling tornado A, and I have it controlling, I switch, like, okay, I want to control 5 and 8, and I'm like, oh, this one controls 5 and 8, and this one controls 4 and 7 or whatever. It changes both. So this is now 5 and 8 as well. If I change this back to 7 and 8, this one now also controls 7 and 8. So some kind of bug where I can't have multiple XY pads controlling the same effect, like tornado, even though tornado is a multi-effects unit. It works if I split it onto different instances of tornado. So it'll work if I say tornado on the purple channel gets controlled by this one, and tornado on the lime channel gets controlled by this one. So just a thing to note if you're using this. I use knobs in a lot of cases and actually use a physical controller for a lot of my effects, but in this case, this works fine for the instance we're going for. So let's just start playing around with this.